In this module, we're going to work through the steps involved in optimizing our inlet cam tuning under wide open throttle ramp run conditions. So this would be what we'd be completing once we've already gone through and optimized our cam timing under steady state conditions. Obviously, what we're talking about here applicable solely to continuously variable cam control engines. For our demonstration, we're using our Subaru STI fitted with our ECU Master MU Black ECU. Despite this engine having quad variable cam control, the ECU Master EMU Black only has 2 cam control outputs, so we're using those to function the inlet cam timing. For the purposes of this demonstration, we're completely ignoring the exhaust cam timing. That will remain fixed, so it's exactly the same as tuning any continuously variable cam control inlet only engine. Of course, the table setups and the functionality of your ECU may differ, but the process is going to be the same. Let's start by jumping into the software. We'll have a quick tour and get our head around what exactly we're going to be doing. So at the moment we are on our VVT tab, and we've already got what we can see here is a reasonably tuned cam target table. We've got the graphical display of that out here on the right hand side, and just looking at it visually for our intake cam timing, we can see that at low RPM we've got 0 degrees advanced, so running at full retard. Likewise at 7,000 RPM up near the rev limiter, we're also fully retarded, which is pretty much what we'd expect from an inlet cam. Likewise, we can see around peak torque, we're at about 40 degrees advanced. We've got 50 degrees of total movement, so probably in the ballpark. And when it comes to optimizing our cam timing under wide open throttle ramp run conditions, more often than not, we will actually be working from a starting point that looks something like this. And the techniques we use when we've already got an established table are a little bit different to what we'd be doing if we're starting from zero. However, for the sake of completeness, we will start by zeroing this table out, and we'll see how we can develop this table from scratch. Given this is a turbocharged engine, for the purposes of our demonstration, we will start by setting the entire table from, in this case, 111 kPa and above. We'll set that all to 0. It is worth mentioning here before we move on that in this table we can see that essentially from about 156 kPa and above, we're really not seeing any notable changes in our cam targets, and particularly from 179 kPa, let's call it 180 kPa and above, the cam targets are identical. So this really sort of comes into our table setup and our resolution or breakpoints of that table. It's not usual that we'll see big cam target changes with changes in our boost pressure. Although if you are pushing a turbocharger very, very hard and the exhaust manifold back pressure is starting to climb excessively, that may dictate some changes to reduce your overlap. But this is not unusual to see something of this nature. Obviously, we're a turbocharged engine here. If you were naturally aspirated, you'd see something very similar. Obviously, we're only operating in pretty much one column at that point, either 100 kPa, there or thereabouts, or 100% throttle. And we'll probably see from maybe 70 or 80 kPa or maybe 70% throttle and above. Again, our cam targets are relatively fixed. So just understanding the likely layout or likely nature of the table is important, so you're not going to end up with any surprises. All right, so let's start here by doing exactly what I mentioned. We'll highlight the entire table down to 111 kPa and set that all to 0. Actually, for the sake of completeness, considering we've only got one column remaining, we'll set the entire table here to 0. All right, so that's set our starting point. Now, before we do our first ramp run here on the dyno, it is worth also mentioning that we're going to expect to see some variations here in our fueling as a result. Given that this particular course is focused on the cam timing, we're not going to dive too much into the fueling, but it's worth understanding what's going to happen here, particularly in this mid-range here where we were around 40 degrees, 38 degrees of advance. We've pulled that all the way back down to 0. What we can rightly expect here is that we will have massively reduced our volumetric efficiency. Now, on a speed density operating system, if we now don't make any appropriate changes to our fuel or VE table, we can expect now that our fueling in that mid-range should go very rich. Now, is that going to be a problem? Well, not particularly, given that was not a lot of point wasting time optimizing our fueling at 0 degrees cam advance and 4,000 RPM, we know very well that we're not going to want to end up with our cam timing anywhere near 0 degrees. So there's not a lot of point optimizing everything for a condition we're just simply not going to be running it. That being said, we obviously want to monitor the air-fuel ratio, make sure it's not excessive to the point that it's going to end up fouling spark plugs or causing a rich misfire that's going to make it impossible for us to continue our tuning. A couple of ways around this. We can manually make changes to our fuel table to accommodate, or most aftermarket ECUs these days do give the option of closed-loop fuel control. Enabling this will let the ECU do some of the heavy lifting in the background, and we can give the ECU a reasonable amount of power here to trim the fueling, maybe plus or minus 15 to 20%. It might not be perfect, but that should get us through, and we're looking for a time-efficient manner of doing this. So that's what I've enabled here. As we go through, we will at least be looking at our fueling to see what's tracking there and what's happening. All right, so we're set up for our first run here. Let's head over to our dyno and we'll get our engine up and running and get our first run underway. All right, we've got our first run complete there. Just looking at the dyno screen, we can see that we ended up with 285 horsepower. Looking at our fueling, it's not perfect, but monitoring it as we go, we can see that it's at least in the ballpark, certainly not dangerous to a point where I would be wanting to abort the run. And we can see at least once we start getting up towards peak boost here, our fueling is sitting pretty close to our reference line of 0.80, so not too bad there. Let's jump into our laptop software and we'll see what we had going on there. So first of all, just looking at our logging for our VVT, just important to make sure that the cam timing is actually doing what we asked it to do. So we can see here the green line here, or green reference for our cam angle bank 1, and the brown line for our cam angle for bank 2. And we can see, no big surprises here, sitting at 0 degrees right through the run. So pretty happy with that, obviously exactly what we asked it to do. Let's also just have a quick look at our fueling here. So we'll come over to our fuel tab and we can see pretty much exactly what we expected here, particularly in the low RPM region. We can see that our fueling in green is sitting quite a lot richer than our purple target. So in this case, the area that I've just highlighted there, our measured lambda 0.84, our target 0.92. Now again, we could clean this up, but we're at 4,500 RPM. We just know that we're not going to be at 0 degrees cam timing, so I'm not particularly worried about this. It is worthwhile just understanding though that if we do get close to the ballpark we're going to be running in, obviously we want to maintain all of the other parameters as close to being consistent as we can. In other words, when we're changing our cam timing, we want that to be the only parameter that's actually affecting our power and torque. So we need to maintain as close to the same boost pressure, as close to the same air-fuel ratio, and of course ignition timing as we can. Now, of course, as we change the cam timing, that in turn has an iterative knock-on effect as we've learned on our ideal ignition timing and our ideal air-fuel ratio, but we'll get to that as we move through. All right, so our first run out of the way there. So that's our reference run here. And what we're going to do is we're going to save that run. And what we're going to do is call that 0 degrees. So this is just going to give us a reference that we can come back to, and we're going to be overlaying all of these runs so we can get a sense of where we want our cam timing to switch. So what we'll do now is we'll save that run. That's actually going to stay up on the screen, which is going to be interesting because we'll actually start to see a sense of what's actually happening as we move our cam timing. All right, let's head back to our VVT, and what we'll do now is we'll highlight that entire operating area, 1300 RPM, 88 kPa and above. Let's set the cam timing to an across-the-board flat 10 degrees. Now let's do another run and we'll see the results of that. All right, second run complete there, and we've got 290 horsepower. The more interesting thing, though, was seeing how much more power and torque, particularly in the low RPM region of that run, we had compared to our first run at 0 degrees. And in fact, really, there was no loss anywhere running 10 degrees instead of 0. Let's jump quickly into our laptop software. We'll see what our cam timing was doing, and as I just move through this ramp run, we can see essentially both cams very close to our target there, so pretty happy with that. We'll just have a quick look at our fueling, and our fueling pretty close. We're still a little bit rich down in this mid-range here. We can see the brown parameter that we've got here is our exhaust gas oxygen correction. So the ECU pulling a little bit of fueling there, but as we move through, particularly once we're up above about 5,000 RPM, the trim is within about 1 or 2%. So the closed loop control doing a reasonable job there, and again my fueling is on track. All right, so we're going to speed up the process here because it's now a rinse and repeat. What we're going to do is we'll save that particular run, and understandably we're going to call that 10 degrees. And what we're going to do now is step up in 10-degree increments all the way through to 50 degrees, which is the maximum travel, and we'll then be able to overlay all of those runs together and get a sense of what our cam timing actually wants to be. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so we've got all of our runs complete there, particularly as we started to advance the cam timing further and further. We saw that we picked up more and more mid-range response, particularly with our boost as well. Our boost was coming in much earlier than our first run with our fixed timing at 0 degrees. However, we did also start to see the power roll away and drop off at higher RPM, exactly what we'd expect as we advance that cam timing. So now what we've got displayed here on our dyno screen is essentially a composite of all of those runs that we've just done, all 6 runs. We can see we start with our blue run, and this really highlights the point that we've located right now, just how powerful this is. Our blue run there, we had 135 horsepower being measured. The white run, which in this case was 40 degrees cam advance, we've picked up to 251 horsepower. So over 100 horsepower gain with our cam timing. However, looking at the downside of this, our purple run right here at the top, 183 horsepower versus our peak there. Blue and red, essentially our 0 and 10 degree, there's really not much, a bit of a coin toss between the two of them, but essentially 282 horsepower. So getting this right, as you can see here, is so important. All right, so what we're going to do now is start building up a bit of a composite map. So what we're looking for here is essentially what our cam timing wants to be at each point, and we're just looking for the line that is the highest. Now we can see that in this case, our purple line here, which is 50 degree advance, that is our peak value or our best power up to around about this point here, about 4,500 RPM. Now, may be that we actually do want to make a few compromises in this, which we'll talk about. But for the moment, what we'll do is we'll just set the table to what the dyno is showing us. So in this case, we started our run from about 2,000 RPM. So closest zone we've got to that is 1,886 RPM. Obviously, our entire table is currently set to 50 degrees. So I'm going to leave that there. The point where we cross over though is 4,500 RPM as we've highlighted, and we want to be at 40 degrees from 4,500 RPM till approximately this point here, about 5,000, 5,200, where we switch to 30 degrees. Our green line, as you can see, overtakes that. So let's find our point here. So we don't actually have a break point at exactly the point we want, but let's just alter that so we do. So we'll make this particular point here 4,500. And then we can make this particular point here 5,000 RPM. So we know that for those particular zones here, we wanted to be at 40 degrees. Now looking back at our dyno sheet here, dyno printout, so from 5,000 RPM, our green line is highest all the way up to, in this case, about 6,000, maybe 6,200 RPM. So let's make our next point here. We'll change our breakpoints here. We'll make them a little bit more sensible, 5,500, and then we'll make 6,000 RPM. And we can always manipulate these as we see fit. So we're going to be at 30 degrees between these two bounds here. Looking back at our dyno graph, we can see we're starting to split here as our higher RPM, and we don't need to be perfect here because our next step of bracketing will help us really fine tune this. So we can see, let's say our yellow 20 degrees is the best up to about 6,500 RPM. So let's just change our breakpoints again. So we're going to enter that as 20 degrees. And then as we advance up, we can see our red line here is superior. Right at the very end of our run, 7,000 RPM, we actually see the blue, our 0 degree, and our 10 degree are essentially giving us exactly the same power. Chances are though, if we run the engine out to 7,500 RPM, we might expect to see the 0 degree advance give us a little bit of a benefit. But again, just for simplicity, let's give the engine exactly what the dyno sheet shows us we want. All right, so we've got a pretty basic setup in here at the moment based on our composite timing that we've just developed using those 6 runs. There are a few problems though, and what we can see here is, if we look at our graphical view, we've got a pretty choppy sort of table. And again, we need to be mindful of the fact that this is a mechanical system. It's not going to do a great job of jumping 10 degrees instantly. It'll track that reasonably well, but sometimes we might end up seeing that the dyno is calling for a change of 20 degrees over quite a short RPM range. So often it